When it comes to how music scenes are formed, it's a mistake to think there's too much logic involved. A single person, law, or event can cause a chain reaction, fusing influences from different corners of the world and resulting in a sound that makes us scratch our heads. Zam Rock is exactly this phenomenon. At least to my American ears, the music sets the tone of a late 70s, Dazed and Confused era high school flick. Cars with bench seating, beers around the bonfire. Yet this music came from Zambia, a country in southern Africa that few people would compare to the American suburbs. During the mid-70s, however, Zambia was experiencing something of a renaissance. The newly independent country was modernizing. Young people were working and took advantage of their economic freedom by going to clubs and buying records. Though it only existed for about half a decade in earnest, Zambia's rock bands took a wild ride, playing to sold-out stadiums, competing for Listener's Choice Awards, and building off each other with endless creativity, a batch of Zam Rock records that almost didn't survive through today. Yes, unfortunately, as has become a theme in these videos, there was a series of tragedies that led to the demise of Zam Rock just a few years after it started. Today there are only a few surviving musicians, such as Emmanuel Jaggery Chanda and Ricky Illalonga, who you'll hear from throughout this video. In 1964, Zambia became independent from the United Kingdom, and the new president, Kenneth Kaunda, began an idealistic agenda of educating and modernizing the country. During the colonial days, Zambia's biggest industry was copper mining. Kaunda was able to seize control of the industry and keep its profits from leaving the borders. In theory, this would lead to more wealth and prosperity for Zambians. Meanwhile, the British upper class who stayed in Zambia began importing rock music from back home, and soon everyone, rich and poor, white and black, was listening to the Beatles, the Stones, as well as Elvis, Buddy Holly, Jimi Hendrix, and James Brown. Young people who grew up listening to these bands soon began playing the music themselves.
Every guitarist in my country who called themselves guitarists, they started by playing Hey Joe.
There was the Lusaka Beatles, who, you guessed it, covered the Beatles, and the Rave 5, who modeled themselves after the Rolling Stones. None of these bands recorded any music because there weren't any recording studios or record labels in Zambia at the time. However, their members would go on to form some of the biggest Zam Rock bands just a few years later. Among the teenagers playing in these early rock bands were Emmanuel Jaggery Chanda and Ricky Illalonga. They quickly found it was possible to make a living playing music, as the country's young workforce was eager to get out and spend their hard-earned cash.
Most of the bands which played in the taverns for the miners were on the Copperbelt, but eventually hotels, started employing musicians for their diners and entertainment. I had a day job once upon a time, but I mean, what I was being paid compared to what I could make over the weekend, I thought to myself, wow, why should I keep doing the same mundane thing?
There it comes.
Both Illalonga and Jaggery would begin taking music more seriously and writing original songs. Jaggery formed the band Witch, that in 1973 would release the first commercial album in Zambia. Called Introduction, the record had a distinct psychedelic garage rock sound.
Introduction.
Jaggery had to get their records pressed in Nairobi, Kenya, as this was the closest record plant, over 2,000 kilometers away. He ordered only 200 records, as that was as much as he and his manager could fit in their luggage. Meanwhile, Ricky Illalonga had formed the band Muzi Otunya, which translates to Smoke That Thunders, the original name of Victoria Falls. His band began releasing 7 inches through a music label in Kenya. A defining moment came when he heard the Ghanaian band Osibisa.
I saw this copy of Osibisa, and I said, wow. And the sound was unique, and they are singing in their own tongue. They are not trying to sound like anybody else but themselves.
Illalonga was himself inspired to begin writing rock songs that incorporated African rhythms. On their first LP, Wings of Africa, you find a diverse range of songs, equally influenced by Afrobeat, as it was Deep Purple. And just as Zambia's rock pioneers were beginning to shape the country's music scene, President Kaunda handed them a golden ticket. In his ever-growing effort to build a strong national identity for Zambia, in June of 1975, Kaunda ordered that radio stations begin playing 90% Zambian music. It was a really good time to be in a band that had just put out a record. As you can imagine, the rock scene blew up. The bands were playing bigger and bigger venues, and a strong musical identity began to emerge. The term Zam Rock, coined by a DJ around this time, described a hodgepodge of prog, psych, and metal that would, at times, blend with Zambian folk and Kalendula music. New bands emerged, and existing bands began to put out their best work. Ricky Ililonga, now going solo, released his LP Zambia, which featured a blend of catchy folk and rock songs, including Shabin Queen. Which released their album Lazy Bones, which featured more refined fuzz rock anthems. It's difficult for me to hear this without thinking of the Brian Jonestown Massacre, a band that would strive to emulate this very sound and lo-fi aesthetic 2 decades later. Paul Ngozi would explore a wide range of hard rock influences, but also would incorporate some Zambian sounds. Kalendula, a type of upbeat dancey folk music, would also become popular in Zambia around this time. The piece, which included members of Witch, released the LP Black Power, which included a range of 60s influences, from Detroit proto-punk to Buffalo Springfield and James Brown. Keith Malevu, who got his start in the Rolling Stones-inspired Rave 5, released a few records starting in 1976. His song, Ubuntungwa, became a mainstream hit and is still widely popular in Zambia today. And Amana Z, whose members included mine workers and anti-colonial freedom fighters, released Africa, an LP that rivals the Velvet Underground in clever pop catchiness.
Hello, Calamine Frame. Where do you think you're going to?
The music reflected the spirit of the times. Zambia was far from a rich country, but it had a sizable middle class by African standards that wanted to enjoy their newfound freedoms.
Anything that was Zambian, by Zambians, musically, people were just buying. The records were cheap. I think it was about 20 cents. Usually it was the youngsters who had just joined the mines, the railways. They used to have free money and they were bachelors, most of them. And that's where we got most support.
Many bands would tour internationally as well, to neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Malawi. Zam Rock shows were taking place in stadiums to thousands of people. As Jaggery told, one of Witch's favorite places to play was the Mindolo Dam recreation area in their hometown of Kitwe. There, bands would play on a stage against the lake, and a crowd of miners, soldiers, office workers, and students would catch fish, barbecue, drink, and dance well into the night. Another great band to emerge was the Blackfoot. They had a super catchy, laid-back rock sound, with incredible vocals delivered by lead guitarist Atman Mapindozi. And a band that explored some of the darker depths of Zam Rock's psychedelia was Salty Dog. For Zam Rock bands, the mid to late 70s were a high point, where they were able to afford some luxuries and enjoy a celebrity status back home. However, what they did not know is that social and economic forces were beginning to erode those freedoms that Zambians were only just beginning to enjoy.
I was making a pretty penny, I was traveling the world, but then we did not realize that the world economic order was changing and it was becoming more expensive to order the vinyls.
That change in the economic order began with a drop in global copper prices, the country's biggest export. As wages fell, Zambians were finding it harder to spend money on records. Furthermore, Zambia faced the threat of bombings and military raids from nearby countries. Although Zambia became independent in 1964, many countries surrounding it were still under colonial or apartheid rule during the 1970s. President Kaunda was not only critical of these regimes, but he actively supported the guerrillas who fought to overthrow them. As a result, the fiercely humanist and idealistic president was forced into a more authoritarian role.
There were two major issues that confused the Zam Rock. The curfew and blackout I talked about.
A national curfew prevented bands from playing at night, and blackouts that resulted from power stations getting bombed by apartheid security forces further complicated live gigs. Bands that once relied on nightly gigging to make a living now had to find day jobs. Some bands did continue to play night shows, however the audience had to be locked into the venue for 12 hours, from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. to avoid getting caught. This obviously was no simple task for a live band, and was part of the reason why Zambians, like the rest of the world, were starting to shift towards disco.
It was easier for a DJ to play different bands in his disco house than to listen to one band.
Despite all the setbacks, some Zam Rockers continued to play music. Ricky Ililonga would continue playing in bands until he eventually moved to Denmark in the 80s. Paul Ngozi stayed in Zambia and was one of the few to maintain a successful career, in part because he adjusted to the now popular Kalandula style of music. Jaggery left Witch at the end of the 70s and took a position teaching music at a Lusaka college. He had just started a family and was looking for more stable work. In 1984, Zambia's first case of HIV was reported, and by 1990, about 13% of the adult population was infected. Particularly vulnerable were the musicians who continued their rock and roll lifestyles. Sadly, almost all of the original Zam Rockers would pass away from what's believed to be AIDS-related complications. Only a lucky few, like Jaggery and Ililonga, who got out of the music industry or left the country, have survived today.
I'm not saying I'm clever. I'm not saying I'm clever, that's why I'm alive. No. It's not that my friends were careless, were reckless, but they were living in self-denial. And then also they didn't have means to go to good hospitals and see proper doctors who tell them what to do. But looking at the number of people that died, by now we would have been making different music. We will have matured musically. But unfortunately, it was not.
Without a market to buy new records and without the musicians to preserve the master tapes, Zam Rock faded to a memory. Though many in the country could still recall the Zam Rock hits of their youth, few recordings survived, save a few cassette bootlegs or scratched up LPs. In recent years, music blogs from the West began writing about Zam Rock, and scratchy old vinyl rips would appear on YouTube. As interest grew, enterprising Western labels like Now Again from Los Angeles would attempt to reissue some of the classics, striking up deals with surviving musicians and amazingly managing to locate many of the original masters. In the last several years, Jaggery and Ililonga have taken up music again, touring Europe and the United States thanks to the renewed interest in Zam Rock. As recently as 2020, Jaggery had tour dates scheduled for the reformed Witch. To listen to more amazing Zam Rock bands I unfortunately didn't have room to include, check out the Spotify playlist linked in the description of this video. There's also links to buy newly reissued LPs for many of the bands mentioned. Last but not least, I want to give a shout out to Highway Hi-Fi Podcast, which published a great episode on Zam Rock, and to Now Again Records, who wrote a fantastic book and released a compilation of Zam Rock hits. Links to both of these are in the description below. Thanks for watching.